this Cambridge Festival webinar on sweetness, women empowerment across Brazil and Spain in the 18th and 19th centuries. My name is Melissa Calarezu, and I am a historian in the Faculty of History and at Gonville and Keys College here in Cambridge. So today we're looking at the stories of tradeswomen, nuns, and cookbook writers who found creative ways to position themselves in what were male-dominated confectionery business, but also public opinion in Spain and Brazil in the 18th and 19th century. This webinar has been organized as part of the Marie Curie Project Suite, funded by the European Union's Horizon 2020 Research and Innovation Program. After the two papers, we're going to have a discussion, and you can ask questions by using the Q&A function or typing them in the chat. If you're tweeting, please remember to use the CamFest hashtag. So our first speaker is Marta Manzanares Mileo, and she's a Marie Curie Fellow at the Faculty of History here in Cambridge with a research project examining the gender dimension of the production of sweets in early modern Spain. She received her PhD in 2018 from the University of Barcelona, and her first monograph, Dolços y Confites a la Catalunya Moderna, looks at the place of sweets in the confectionery trade in early modern Barcelona. So I'm going to hand over to Marta. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Melissa, for the introduction. Let me just pass. I can't. Oh yeah. Can you see the next slide?
Yes.
Oh yeah. So I would like to start with this illustration called La Conficiosa, or the Female Confectioner, by Nicolas de la Marsan. This is an engraving that is part of a series of satires representing the trades of Paris in late 17th century. If we look at her, we can see that her dress is made of the utensils and ingredients of the confectionery trade. She wears a dress ornamented with candied fruits, fruit preserve, boxes of fruit preserve, and sugar almonds. Her chest is a bucket of marzipan and sponge fingers. But La Marsan represented with a female, with a female body, certain traits and crafts traditionally ascribed to women, including the baker, the fishmonger, the butter seller, or the fruit seller. And I think what is interesting of these images is that they show that women were associated with these particular professions in the popular imagination, despite being excluded from the guild system in Paris as elsewhere in Europe. But the truth is that women were, in fact, actively engaged and involved with flourishing commercial activities in that period. So going back to the female confectioner, I think I want to use this image as a starting point to think about the intersections between women's sweetness and the production of sweets in early modern Europe, and more specifically in Spain. Visual and literary representations of genteel mothers and wives, fickle noble women, industrious nuns, and poor female street sellers of sweets illustrate the different ways in which women were connected to sweet food in the European culture and imagination. The making of confectionery was regarded as an acceptable skill of elite women, as being part of the domestic duties of taking care of the family and hospitality. As the historian Kim Hall notes, women produced sophisticated sugar banquets and cakes as a way to display their culinary skills, social distinctions, and gender identities, while contributing to maintaining the political economy of England in the 17th century. These homemade sweets were meaningful gifts that women exchanged in order to reinforce their social bonds, as Amanda Herbert, among many others, have shown. Spanish women engaged with the domestic production of sweets in the same way. Nonetheless, the social and economic contributions of women to the marketing of sugar-based food still remains less well understood. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the dramatic rise in consumption of sweets was only possible as a result of the increasing arrival of sugar produced in large plantations in the Americas by thousands of African enslaved people. Following the seminal work of Sidney Mintz, scholars have clearly demonstrated that the increased production of sugar plantations and the Atlantic slave trade shape consumer habits, but also ideas of gender and race in Europe. European visual culture illustrates highly gendered images of sugar production. The brutal masculine nature of sugar plantations coexisted with ideals of female production and eating of sweets, linked to the ideas of sensuality and female indulgence. In this talk, I want to stress the need to incorporate a gender analysis in the early modern history of sugar, which allows us to complement and expand the important historiography on plantation economies and the Atlantic slave trade. So this paper examines female production of sweets in early modern Spain, with a particular focus on Barcelona, in which a powerful guild controlled the confectionery market. Here, I will trace the production of sweet food in different. I will trace the individual stories of women of different social groups who engage with the production of sweets in different ways. To date, scholars of early modern confectionery trade have mainly focused on male confectioners serving in aristocratic households, and also as part of urban guilds. Here, instead, I will show how elite and non-elite women made use of the legal and material resources and also social connections to gain social and economic agency, challenging institutional and social barriers. By crossing a wide range of official and unofficial documents, this talk moves from symbolic associations in which women were objects of sweetness and desire to explore real female practices of making sweets. Some of these practices went well beyond the limits prescribed by social expectations. I argued that the guilds denied access to the formal positions of authority to women, but women still have significant power in shaping consumer habits and tastes, both as consumers and producers of sweets. As I said, today I will focus on the city of Barcelona, a port commercial city with a male-dominated guild system. The city was the second main commercial center of the Spanish monarchy, only after the main Spanish colonial trade port of Cádiz. By the turn of the 18th century, Spain experienced a gradual process of economic growth, expansion of colonial trade, and also it witnessed the introduction of new forms of sociability. In this context, domestic rituals of drinking chocolate along with biscuits and other confectionery goods became the quintessential expression of luxury, taste, and social distinction in 18th century Spain. These refreshments of chocolate and biscuits were an essential part of everyday visits and formal receptions and parties held in the household. The consumption of foreign commodities, mainly tobacco, sugar, and cocoa, became central to the self-fashioning of the plural elites of Barcelona, which were members of the old nobility, honored citizens, merchants, and also liberal professionals. From the mid-17th century, increasing quantities of sugar arrived at the port of Barcelona, mainly coming from the plantations in Brazil and the Caribbean. Some small sugar mills remained in the peninsula, mainly located in the coast of Granada and Valencia, but the production could not compete with the quality and prices of colonial refined sugars. The rise of colonial trade prompted to the expansion of Catalan economy, in which grocer confectioners played a key role. Sugar transformed consumer behavior and the nature of the guild system of Barcelona itself. It creates new businesses, opportunities for urban traders, but also for many entrepreneurial women, as I will show you later. Since 1562, the College of Grocer Confectioners dominated the market of sugar, drugs, sweets, and other foreign commodities in the city. Grocer confectioners controlled the whole process of the confectionery trade, from the provision of raw sugars to the introduction and marketing of confectionery goods. Some wealthy grocer confectioners, along with local and foreign merchants, created business partnerships to import large quantities of these foreign commodities, but mainly sugar, tobacco, and cocoa. It was a prestigious and highly specialized trade. Grocers' confectioners held a privileged social position in the city. The access to this guild was therefore very restrictive. According to guild regulations, guild membership was limited to Christian men with 3 years of formal apprenticeship. So conversos and all women were explicitly excluded. The Grocers' Confectioners Guild was clearly masculinized, but it doesn't mean that the women were completely absent from the sweets market. So I'm going to turn now to show some examples of women of different backgrounds and occupations who participated formally or informally in the confectionery trade in Barcelona. And I want to start first with Caterina Vila or Vidal, depends on the document. She was a widow of the grocer confectioner Rafael Vila o Vidal. And in November 1675, guild officials ordered Catalina to close her shop located in Carrer Ample. After the widowhood year, widows must close their shops immediately. Otherwise, they have to pay a fine of £10 for each day the shop remained open. But in that occasion, Caterina refused to pay and petitioned the municipal authorities to revoke the fine imposed by guild officials. The magistrates granted her a license to keep the business open for a short period of time. But after that, Caterina's store remained open. And when the officials went there to close the shop, they only found a journeyman running the shop. And Caterina was not there. So guild officials appealed to the Real Audiencia, the highest royal tribunal, against Josep Nicolau, the journeyman that was working in Caterina's shop. They accused him of creating an illicit partnership with the widow. According to guild regulations, only guild masters with equal shares could establish a licit and true partnership. Despite being an illicit practice, some widows agreed with journeymen to run their business for them, while the widows still obtained the benefits of the business. In that case, Josep Nicolau finally confessed that he worked and lived in Caterina's shop in order to maintain her shop open after the first widowhood year. Although he said that she was still the owner of the shop. So I want to turn now to the case of Madrona Costa, a baker and pastry cook, who catered the important social events of the urban elites of Barcelona in the late 18th century and early 19th century. For instance, Madrona Costa provided a range of sweet baked goods for the weddings of the Magarolas, members of the Catalan nobility. She also sold the sponge biscuits and cakes to the wealthy bourgeois Erasme de Gónima, patron of one of the main calico factories in Barcelona. As you can see here, the bills were signed by Miguel Cabáñez, and with a note saying that Madrona Costa doesn't know how to sign, which suggests a low level of education and social status of the baker. In the other recipe, the recipe is signed by her nephew, Pau Pujol. Nevertheless, the social status and illiteracy of Madrona did not stop her to establish a flourishing business and gaining prestige as a baker among the urban elites. Likewise, urban elites bought sweet baked goods and other confections made by nuns. The expertise of nuns in the production of sweets was widely recognized across the early modern Catholic world, as it is still today. Female religious communities produced sweets to welcome royal visitors, clerical officials, and benefactors. It was an expression of hospitality, and nuns used them to obtain privileges and favors. In addition, the sale of convent-made sweets provided nunneries with a source of extra income in periods of hardship. However, religious moralists regarded this practice with suspicion. In La Religión Instruida, the Franciscan writer Antonio Arbiol condemned, and I quote, the improper occupation of making sweets, mainly intended for sale. He states that this activity led young nuns to spend their time making sweets instead of praying, and make them dislike the retreat of their cells. He continues saying that the production of sweets made a lot of noise, disturbing the peaceful convent, and transformed, and I quote, the sacred convent of the Brides of Christ into a business house or casa de negociación. But despite Albiol's objections, the production of convent sweets was commonplace in early modern Spain. In Barcelona, the nobleman Rafael Amat de Cortada, known as the Baron of Maldà, refers to a number of convent-made desserts, made specifically in feast days. For example, on Saint Joseph Day, everyone must eat mató de monja, literally nun's fresh cheese. According to Marta, mató de monja must be sold or given by a nun that day. As the name of this dessert indicates, a dessert made of milk, almonds, egg yolks, and sugar was generally prepared in female convents in the period. But Maldà was not the only one to praise the work of nuns in making holiday desserts. In 1750, municipal magistrates defended female convents against confectioners' aspirations to control the sale of sponge biscuits and pastries, as those you can see in the image. When confectioners requested a royal privilege to sell pastries made with sugar, the authorities argued that a new confectioner's privilege, and I quote, would affect the rights of bakers, cafe owners, and female convents who put a lot of effort into making these popular sweet baked goods on holidays and festival days. The convents of Barcelona may have been well known by the excellence of these sponge biscuits, as those made in the monastery of San Pere de las Puelas. The Benedictine monastery of San Pere, located in the commercial area of La Ribera, participated in the local economy by renting different properties. And many of their professed nuns were daughters of wealthy families of Barcelona, and they continue to maintain their social connections. The family papers of aristocratic families show that they usually order sweet baked goods from San Pere for the provision of the refreshments for special social events. In this receipt here, you can see that the nuns of San Pere made a large amount of sponge biscuits, flat cakes, and biscuits and sugar-coated biscuits for the wedding of the noblewoman Ribas y Centelles. It was a large event with more than 80 women and 200 men invited, including the Capità General, which was who was the main governor of Catalonia in that moment. And which is interesting here is that the receipt explicitly indicates that the nuns produced these goods after giving them the ingredients. Another example of this practice can be found in another document. In that case, the prioress of San Pere asked the sons, another wealthy family of Barcelona, to cover the cost of the refreshments served the day when Maria Teresa Sanz and Ignacia Fivillet took the vows in the convent. Nuns' professions were celebrated, large events, public events, celebrated with abundant and splendid refreshments of chocolate and biscuits and confectionery, as it was custom in the period. But when we turn the page of this document, of this petition, it reads what is required for the making of egg biscuits, listing 10,000 eggs, 8 pounds of good sugar, 2 pounds of extra fine starch, and 1 pound of very good flour, which it looks like a recipe almost. The family probably paid for the ingredients in advance so that the nuns could make the biscuits before the major event. The request of these particular special desserts may evidence the family and social connections between the monastery and the urban elites. In fact, 4 abbesses of Sant Pere were members of the Sands family. And just to conclude, I want to finish with this painting of El Born, the main food market in Barcelona in the 18th century, because I think it makes clear that women played a crucial role in the provisioning of food markets and shaping consumer practices and tastes in the city. As we have seen, women's work remains sometimes invisible in guild regulations, but it doesn't mean that women were totally absent, as they participated formally, informally, or even illegally in the confectionery trade. Master widows, street vendors, and even the nuns produced and sold their delicious goods in the urban space. They were even competing with the prestigious confectioners. Women's economic activities went well beyond social expectations that confined them to the domestic sphere. By making and selling sweets, women gained cultural, social, and economic agency, facing and contesting institutional and social constraints. And I think I will leave it here. And thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Marta. Thanks very much. Thanks for being able to see also the archival documents is always exciting to see. Thank you. Okay, we're going to have a discussion at the end. So we're going to move on to Helen Mardin, who is a PhD student of history with a concentration in Latin American history at the University of South Carolina. Her research interests include interdisciplinary approaches that deal with food, material culture, architecture, art, women and gender studies, as well as digital history. She was an undergraduate in architecture and urbanism at the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul in Brazil in 2004, and she received a master's in art history at the University of South Carolina in 2018 with a dissertation on Piranesi, which sounds really interesting. Okay, so I'll pass it over to you, Helen.
Good afternoon. Here is still the morning, but still. Let me share my screen here. Okay. There you go.
Perfect. Thanks.
So thank you so much, Melissa, for the introduction. Thank you, Marta, for inviting me to this panel. I'm very excited to be here talking about women and sweetness. So Marta presented women as consumers and how women shaped the consumption and production of sugary treats. And I will show another facet of women's production or women involvement with sugar and confectionery in my talk. So my talk is named A Mystery in the Cookbook, Authorship and Gender in 19th Century Culinary Literature in Brazil. And I will focus on 7 cookbooks published between 1840 and 1900 in Brazil. Here are the 7 cookbooks. I want to mention that before these cookbooks were published in Brazil, there were another cookbooks that circulated in Brazil, but they were all imported, and that made their prices very prohibitive. So these cookbooks were partially Brazilian because they were either edited or printed in Brazil, which reduced their costs. And the first one of these cookbooks to be fully edited and printed in Brazil, it was The Popular Cook, which was only in 1900. And that's because it reduced so much the cost of the book, it's also a reason why the title is popular, The Popular Cook. Anyway, most of these cookbooks were edited and reissued tens of times, which shows a high demand for culinary literature in Brazil. And here I present them in chronological order, together with some info, like the date first, and then the title, the press, and the author. And you can get, by the gender signs that I put there, some patterns in the authorship of these cookbooks. So some books were signed only with the initials of the author, like RCM or ASQ. One of them is completely anonymous, the National Cook, and the others disclose the authorship. So far, so good, even though the mystery about these authors is something that rings a bell and we need to investigate and look further. A little more information about the first of these cookbooks to be published. It is called the Imperial Cook. And it is basically a compilation of recipes taken from two Portuguese cookbooks. One is Kitchen's Artistry, and the other is Modern Cook. Kitchen's Artistry had been first published in 1640 by a chef named Domingos Rodrigues. So at the time the Brazilian Imperial Cook was published, this book was already 200 years. It had a long, long life. And the other book, Modern Cook, was first published in 1780 by the chef Lucas Rigaud. What is interesting to note is that even though these cookbooks had been deliberately copied by the Imperial Cook, the fact that they used signature of the authors, both chefs of the Portuguese crown, to arouse interest in the audience was not copied by the Brazilian counterpart. So it imitated everything but the info on the identity of the author, even though it claims that RCM, the author, was an important chef, hypothetically the chef of Emperor of Brazil. And many scholars have tried to find out about this person, but his or her, because we don't know, identity remains largely unknown. It keeps me wondering why the authorship is so mysterious, and whether the mystery stems from the fact that the writer was a woman. It's a plausible idea. Another fascinating facet of this book is that it shows the connection between gastronomy and civilization since the very beginning of culinary literature in Brazil. And this connection will constantly show up in other of these cookbooks as well, in all of them, in fact. So in these passages reproduced here in this slide, you can see that not only cooking enjoyed a status of high art in the 19th century, but also of science. It was a science. And Brazilians felt like they were behind in comparison to other nations and needed cookery as a means to bridge the gap between what was seen as backwardness or savagery and the sophistication of the, in quotes, more advanced nations, referring to Europe, obviously. So gastronomy was given this civilizing mission, and culinary literature was one important tool to promote national development and improvement. And what I'm trying to say here is that culinary writing mattered a great deal at this time, and authors occupied a position of power in selecting recipes and influences, dictating the desirable ingredients and techniques, and ultimately shaping the construction of a Brazilian cuisine and a Brazilian identity through foodways. And here I arranged the book by author. So you can see that out of the 7 books, 3 were signed by women, 1 by men, and 3 didn't release the identity or the sex of the authors, even though a male authorship is implicit. Even so, the ratio is intriguing, especially in contrast to other genres in which the presence of male authors is significantly, not to say massively, higher. And here we have just 1 book out of the 7 knowingly signed by a man. An important aspect to consider in this context is that the literacy of women in 19th century Brazil, even within the elite, was extremely low. So this ratio, showing a robust presence of women in the culinary publishing industry, demonstrates the key role of gastronomy to women in the 19th century and their interest and even investment in this type of writing. I say that women were quick to perceive that culinary literature was a tool for empowerment to guarantee their participation in the debates that were shaping the nation. And literature, culinary literature was an acceptable, if not the only instrument to carve out their space and voice their opinions. And to make it clearer, in this slide, I rearranged the same cookbooks in a different order. Here, I sorted them out according to their genre, if you will. We have what I call comprehensive cookbooks, are those including all sorts of meals, savory and sweet dishes, soups, all sorts of meats, bakery, sauces, soups, and so on. Another genre is specialized in confectionery. And here we have a very interesting picture of the culinary literature. Out of the 7 books, 4 were specialized in confectionery, which shows a preference or a demand for this sort of food. And please don't forget that Brazil was one of the largest sugar productions in the world since the 16th century. So we had like abundance of sugar. But not only that, if you take the disclosed gender of the authors, you'll see that out of these 4 books, 3 were signed by women. And their titles used female nouns, so they are completely gendered. In Portuguese, as in other Romance languages, nouns, articles, adjectives have masculine and feminine forms, and that's why I included female in brackets to convey in English that these were titles purposefully gendered and targeted a female audience as well. So you can also see that sweetness and womanhood was intimately associated. In contrast, the comprehensive cookbooks were published anonymously and implied a male authorship. And we can conclude that it was acceptable for women to write and publish books specialized in confectionery, but only in confectionery. But other types of food, the expectation was for male authorship. And here I want to point out that in my research, I found that the initials ASQ from the book in the middle, The Popular Cook, refer to a woman, Ana Silva Quaresma. She was the wife of the owner of this particular press named Quaresma Books. It was a woman who deliberately concealed or had her identity concealed. And this is interesting. So I already mentioned that the authors of these cookbooks with their civilizing mission had a deep impact on the debates about what it meant to be Brazilian, how Brazil could improve its habits and become more modern and civilized, whose influences would fit into this narrative, and what food would best nourish the future protagonists of the nation. And cookery, like nation building, was all about selecting groups. And culinary literature was no different. When sweetness was associated with womanhood and the feminine, women saw a great opportunity to write their own visions of Brazilian cuisine and participate in the conversations about the future of the nation. Who and whose traditions should be represented in the pages of these cookbooks, as elsewhere. So I'm talking about issues of race, class, religion, nationality, among others. Not yet. So we can see an example of the power of culinary literature in Brazil in this book. It was the second cookbook ever published in Brazil, specialized in confectionery, and it was the first to use the word Brazilian in a title, advancing on the construction of a national cuisine. What is mysterious about this book is that even though it was signed by a woman called Constança Oliva de Lima, historians have learned that it was really written by another woman, Dona Maria das Virgens Pereira Rabelo e Gavin. Some authors claim that Constança, who signed the book, was only a sort of editor of the first edition compiled by Dona Ana after her own recipe notebooks and her collection of cookbooks. She was daughter of wealthy sugarcane and coffee plantation owners and married to a Portuguese nobleman, Commendador José Gavinho Viana, a successful businessman. The question is, why would Dona Ana hide her identity? One explanation is that as a high-class, very aristocratic woman in a patriarchal society like Brazil, public exposure was a taboo and a huge no-no. So she had to use the name of another woman as a disguise to navigate her yearning for public participation while facing the limits that patriarchy imposed on her. And now to come to a close, I hope to have demonstrated how culinary literature and the gendered character of confectionery provided women with a unique opportunity to take part in debates that shaped not only Brazilian cuisine, but Brazilian identity as well. And I'll leave you with a picture of my favorite Brazilian dessert, which is quindim. It is made out of egg yolks, sugar, and coconut. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Helen. Okay, if people want to put questions in the chat, that would be great. Just give people a few minutes to do that. I had a kind of question about the agency of women and the association with sugar. And there, I mean, there is a kind of criticism in the 18th century about luxury consumption. And it's often associated with luxury goods, including sugar, ice cream. It also relates to porcelain and things like that. So I wanted to know, I guess, first from Marta, how that plays out in her study of the kind of representation of women, how that critique of luxury plays out in the 18th century in the literature, and then Helen, what happens to that in the 19th century. So there is this association of women and sweetness, but there's also a growing kind of criticism of luxury, which is often seen as a kind of as female.
Yeah, thank you so much, Melissa, for this question. Yes, actually, I mean, this criticism linking luxury and consumerism and women is very, very clear in the context of critiques to these refreshments, these domestic rituals of drinking chocolate along with biscuits and confectionery goods that I was trying to make that point in the during my presentation, that they were celebrated everywhere. I mean, for weddings, christenings, religious professions of nuns, among the elites, but also in everyday visits. So one of the main criticism of the elites in that moment is the tendency of these women spending each afternoon drinking chocolate and eating sweets. One day in one of the neighbors, and the next day in the other house. So yeah, I think is in that critiques to these refreshments is when we can see clearly this connection between critiques of luxury, sugar, and femininity.
Helen, do you have anything to add to that? I don't know if there's that same metaphor used in the 19th century.
In the 19th century, the picture had changed a little bit because sugar had become much more popular and more affordable as well, because especially in Brazil, where there was this abundance of sugar everywhere. And one thing to consider is that even in the regions that did not produce sugar in Brazil, like I'm studying the south of Brazil, where climate, soil were not appropriate to grow sugarcane, there were other commodities, and the trade was made in a way that sugar was used as a currency. So still there was a circulation of sugar even as a currency across the country, and sugar was abundant in all regions, really. There is some class connotations to certain recipes in Brazil. So for example, the recipes that were modeled after Portuguese recipes, they were considered more exquisite, more refined, more sophisticated than recipes produced with fruits, like fruit compotes, and this kind of, there is a hierarchy in confectionery in which we have some kinds of recipes that are more luxury or sophisticated than others. But I think in terms of sugar, the commodity itself in Brazil in 19th century, this is not so much, it's almost absent.
So when you say, that's interesting about the hierarchies and the relationship with fruit. So what is a luxury in Europe is not a luxury in Brazil. So something like the pineapple. So that would be, in some ways, part of those fruit compotes, and something would be seen as less luxurious.
Right, and we have in the 19th century in Brazil, waves of immigrants, European immigrants, and they used to plant a lot, they grow a lot of fruits, and they have the surplus, and they were poor whites, they were usually poor European whites that moved to Brazil. And so the kind of sweets that they produced were not considered sophisticated, or it was not a luxury. They are called, it's almost like a lowbrow confectionery.
We don't have any questions, but I don't know whether each of you have a question for Marta. Has a question.
I have many questions, but yeah, I'm going to just ask a couple. I was thinking about the role and the agency of these female street sellers. Probably most of them are from African descent, and I can't remember. There is a specific name for these Brazilian street vendors of sweets, I think. And I think, and I would like if you can say a little bit more about these specific sweets that maybe these women made and sold on the streets, and in which kind of ingredients, and if you can see some sort of culinary hybridization there. And also I was about to ask about your social role of confectionery in 19th century Brazil, because I guess that probably it's the consumption of sugar, as you said, or of sweets might be a little bit different from maybe Europe in the 18th century or even the 19th century, which is, at least in some parts of Spain, it was very, very expensive commodity. Thanks.
Yes, thank you for this great question. So the first one is about it's about the women selling sweets in the streets, and this is it was very common in all the cities, all the urban centers in Brazil in the 19th century, and even before that, 18th century, we have these figures as well. So they are two names. They were called quitandeiras, or sometimes they are quitandeiras, but they are also what we call like escravos de ganho, which is a kind of slave that went to the streets to sell goods. It could be the surplus of domestic production of vegetables and fruits, and often they were sellers of the sweets produced in the houses of slave owners. So there is a system of women, like women cooking and women selling in the street. It is a very interesting connection, actually. Some women could afford their manumission. Some enslaved women could afford their manumission through the selling of the sweets in the streets. They were very popular. I have come across some records of the sweets. So there are all sorts of sweets made out of coconut and sugar. Sometimes they were sort of cakes, like sponge cakes, this kind of sweets. And it's a very common image of in slavery in Brazil. These women carrying like big trays on their heads and selling these sweets in the streets. So the other question is about consumption and patterns of consumption of sugar in Brazil. And there is this hybrid cuisine. I agree, this is a great term to use for this kind of production. And again, confectionery was very hierarchical in Brazil. So there are the sweets produced with the base of Portuguese recipes. They were made basically from egg yolks and sugar. Sometimes coconut was or other nuts were included in these recipes, and they gave like a local flavor. But these sweets were consumed also not only in the elites, among the elites, but also in more popular classes. So if you take, for example, people of African descent in Brazil, their religion have a whole practice around what they call the sacred table. So they do offerings for the deities, and they are foods, and many of them are sweets. So for example, the sweet that I showed in the last slide, the quindim, that is made out of egg yolks, sugar, and coconut, they have a great meaning for these religions of African descent, because coconut, both coconut and the egg, they are symbols of fertility. So they were offered, for example, for deities linked to fertility and love. So it's a complicated categorization of confectionery, because they will show up both in the tables of the elite and in this African religious. So you cannot use the term, high confectionery or low confectionery. They are very nuanced, and I'm very interested, actually. I'm very interested in these nuances, and to break a little bit with this categorizations that it is very flawed in many ways. And the contrary is also true. So for example, the sweets that I mentioned before, made out of fruits, they were considered like lowbrow or low confectionery, but they also were present in the tables of the elites. It depended on the fruit, but it's still, they were present. So there are historical records showing that there is this blurred line between these categories that we need to investigate further.
Thanks, Helen. Helen, I don't know if you have a question for Marta. Also, again, encourage anyone participating to put a question in the Q&A box. Helen, do you want to ask a question, or should I go ahead?
I have a question. I was fascinated about the fact that women could not hold their position as businesswomen in 18th century Spain. And when they were widows, they could not, keep with their businesses. So this lasted beyond the 18th century. So do you have any trace of when this end?
Thank you for that. And actually, I see that there is a question in the chat, so I'm going to answer both. So yeah, I mean, that's the problem with women access is because of guilds, the guild system, that they didn't allow women to have to establish their own business, to access to the mastership, the apprenticeship first, and then the mastership. And even when, as I said, when they are widows, they couldn't keep their husband's business. And the situation changed completely when the abolition of guilds. In early 19th century. So that's why, I think this is the short answer. And for the journeymen were these confectioners that they didn't pass the mastership exam. So they were not allowed. They have about 3 or 5 years of experience as an apprentice, and they work in another for another master confectioner, but they were not allowed to establish independent businesses because they don't have this mastership or this. They were not official guild members.
Yeah, I guess that's why it's interesting that nuns are making these confectionaries, because it's entirely outside of the guild system. And I think also what's interesting is that widows find their way, not just in terms of confectionery, but in a whole range of kind of food arts, where widows often find ways of participating, because they, and in fact, Marta and I were talking about this the other day, that widows often are able to continue, even illegally, some of these trades precisely because they have the knowledge. So the knowledge doesn't sit just with the man, although the man is the only one who appears on the guild member is the only one who appears in the archival documents. It's clear in other contexts and with other food guilds that women continue because they actually have the knowledge, even if they haven't done the apprenticeship. I had a question. Thank you, Avril, for the question. I had a question for both of you about enslavement. I mean, both of you've mentioned the fact. I mean, this is about the 18th and 19th century, because sugar things like confectionery becomes much more popular precisely because the price goes down, and the price goes down precisely because of the enslavement and greater efficiency of plantations in places like Brazil. No, so I wanted to know to what extent the people who are writing about sugar in the 18th century are aware of enslavement. So there's an art historian called Julie Hochstrasser who's written about the Dutch in the 17th century, and she argues actually that Dutch consumers have the information to know what's going on in the sugar plantations. And I think slavery is stopped in the 1860s. Is that right, in Brazil? Helen?
It was abolished in 1888.
1888, okay. So I guess the question is, there is this British history about abolition and sugar not made by slaves, right? So there's a kind of growing consumerist movement at the end of the 18th century, and objects associated with sugar and cotton not made by slaves. So I just wanted to know, is there anything similar in either the Spanish imperial context or the Brazilian context into the 19th century?
Can I go, Marta?
Yes.
Yeah, I didn't come across a lot of references to slavery. I mean, of course, everybody knew that sugar was produced in the sugar plantations based on labor, enslaved labor. This was public knowledge. But I don't see any concern from consumers to address this situation in their eating habits. And I think in a way I compare to some eating habits that we have today, and we know they are problematic, but I think that's in a way is the power of taste. Because sugar was so tasty, everybody loved the taste of sugary food. So I think it was this more humanitarian concerns, let's put it this way, they were not on the forefront of people's concerns. Not that I have, I didn't find anything that would indicate like a concern about it.
Yeah, no, thank you, Melissa, for your question. Yeah, this is something that I've been thinking quite a lot and looking for that to compare with the British Empire, and with the movement of the abolitionist movement and consumption of sugar. And I only found this in the case of Spain in the 19th century, the early 19th century, and when it was Puerto Rico and Cuba, they started to be, or they came to be like sugar islands for the first time, because before that the sugar plantations were very small, but when start like the sugar plantation system in those particular islands became more important is in the early 19th century. So it's slightly later than maybe in the French or English case. But yeah, definitely there is a social critique on some intellectuals and writers. Yeah.
Yeah, but not in the recipe books themselves.
No, I haven't seen that. Yeah, no, not in the recipe books.
Sorry, I don't know quite what to do. Yeah, thank you. Well, thanks to you both. I'm hoping that the phone won't ring again. Thanks for you, those of you who've attended, and thank you for the question. And I hope, well, thanks. This is really interesting to have this new research on sweetness and on women and on the relationship between women and sugar, but also on the way in which women find agency also, either through the writing of cookbooks or through the making of confectionery. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Melissa.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.